sector, and they attracted very wealthy endowments from the people who went there, and they got very, 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 very rich. And today, the Oxford and Cambridge colleges are some of the wealthiest landowners in this country. Trinity College in Cambridge is the third wealthiest landowner in the country. So they are now very, very rich and powerful institutions. And they're all housed in this relatively small city. So Oxford became a very, very prominent place in the 500 years after the Norman conquest. And if we look at the next slide.
Yeah, we are on the next slide.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So we're looking at the Oxford crown. This is a coin minted by Charles I, who was a king who got into a lot of trouble in this country. And in fact, there was a revolution. It was one of the first revolutions because of his tyrannical rule. And he had to flee London because they kicked him out of London and Westminster. And he set up an alternative government in Oxford. Which shows you just how important Oxford was at the time. And he was then under siege. He was besieged in Oxford and had to eventually leave Oxford. Shakespeare was associated with Oxford around this time. And then as the centuries moved on, Oxford was a really important place for the training of administrators for the British Empire. So it was almost imperative if you were going to be posted out into the empire that you had done some time in Oxford. So Oxford retained its position all the way through the centuries, and then bringing us back up to the present day. So we have, as you can imagine, a whole range of historic buildings in Oxford, dating the whole span of those years. We're going to look at some now. So the next slide, please, Mazza.
Yeah. Radcliffe camera.
Yeah, the Radcliffe camera. So this is a very famous building in Oxford, very unusual with its round rotunda shape. It was built by Sir Christopher Wren in the late 17th century, and is really one of the focal points of the university city. It sits right in the heart of it. There are colleges all around it. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. Now a library, and a major focal point for visitors. So it's just to give you some idea of the quality of the built environment of the heritage in Oxford. Radcliffe Camera is one of the most famous buildings. And then if we move on to the next slide, the Ashmolean Museum. So this again has a very sort of interesting history. The earliest collection that was housed by the Ashmolean Museum was initially got together, compiled by a man called John Tradescant, who's one of the early collectors, the earliest collectors, who had his collection in a house on the banks of the Thames in London. And then it was bought by Elias Ashmole. And Ashmole brought it to Oxford and housed it first in an older building, which is now the History of Science in Oxford, and then moved it to the current site at the Ashmolean Museum, which in turn has had many additions and renovations and expansions over the years. That site of the current building you're looking at is a very, very ancient site. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the kings of England had a palace on this site, very near it. And today, again, the Ashmolean, is a huge draw for visitors. It has millions of visitors every year, and again is a central point in the architectural environment in Oxford. And then moving on, we're going to look at another site in Oxford, Port Meadow, which is not a built site. It's a natural site, but one with immense value and importance from a heritage and a conservation point of view. It's known as a floodplain, and a floodplain is an area of ground that floods naturally every year in the winter with additional rainfall, and sometimes in the summer. So has to be kept clear and can't build on it because for that reason. In addition, Port Meadow has never been ploughed. It's never had the plough go through it. So it's like other sites in Oxford, it's retained its ancient flora. So we have a whole range of wildflowers and natural habitats that we struggle to ever recreate with ploughing, because ploughing, you know, gets all the soil up, and it's very difficult for ancient traditional flora to re-establish. So it's a very, very important site. It's also common land, has a special designation as common land, which was once widespread in this country. And common land was really, really important at one time for villagers and, you know, ordinary folk, because they gave people access to, you know, natural resources, like in the forest, for example. You know, there would be game, and people could hunt the game for meat. And slowly over the years, we lost a lot of our common ground. It became enclosed. But Port Meadow is still one of the genuine common land. And it means that if you have a freeman status in Oxford, you're allowed to graze your animals on Port Meadow. So it's a very, very special place, and long, you know, treasured by the residents of Oxford, because it's such a beautiful place to walk and to visit. Now, a few years ago, we had a big conflict on the edges of Port Meadow. And if we move on to the next slide.
Next slide.
And we have a before and after shot. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Can you see the buildings behind the guy on the bicycle?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so they were put up by the university as student accommodation very, very quickly, almost overnight. There were huge fights about the planning process and whether they'd complied with planning regulations and so on and so forth, and got proper consultation from the community. They hadn't, but nobody could stop them building because they put the buildings up so fast. And the result was, you know, there was outrage, absolute outrage throughout Oxford at what they'd done, because it was seen that they had really, you know, gone some way to actually damage Port Meadow with these incredibly unsightly buildings, and, you know, much more impact on the ground and everything like that. So after a protracted fight, the university formally apologised for what they'd done. There were hopes that they would actually lower the buildings or even take them down altogether. Of course, they weren't going to do that, but they have promised to make good the surrounding area. So they're going to grow a lot of trees. You know, they're going to try and screen the buildings off from Port Meadow. And hopefully we can go some way at least to restoring what is a very, very special site. But there was a real fight over this, and it's an indication of just how precarious our heritage is, because it can be taken at any time. So those are some examples from Oxford, and we still have ongoing issues in Oxford. It's increasingly becoming a tourist destination. So how do we manage that? It puts complex demands on the city. We have constant conflicts about housing versus hotels or retail spaces as opposed to, infrastructure for locals. One of the results of that is a lot of people who work in Oxford can't afford to live there, so they have to drive in and out every day. So then there's a lot of traffic and a lot of pollution, and all these issues just remain ongoing, really, and there's no easy solution to them. Okay, moving on then. The next case study we're going to look at is the Blitz. So next slide, please.
Yes.
So you're looking at the Messerschmitt, which is one of the most feared aeroplanes, bombers, from the Luftwaffe. And I don't know if anybody's heard of the Luftwaffe. It was the fighting force built by the Germans ahead of the invasion of Europe in 1939. Lethal, absolutely lethal, with very, very heavy payload, huge bomb, capable of carrying huge bombs. And the Messerschmitts did untold damage in the first days of the Second World War. Nobody was prepared for the onslaught that was unleashed by the Blitzkrieg. Shortly after the invasion of Czechoslovakia and in 1939, the Germans bombed Poland and laid much of Poland, the urban areas of Poland, to waste. And then they rapidly turned on this country. And we were totally unprepared for it here. We were complacent, to say the least, about Hitler's intentions and capabilities. The British position had always been, well, it doesn't matter, they can do what they want in Europe, as long as they leave us alone. And they didn't leave us alone, they came for us. And if we move to the next slide. So it's widely known that the Germans bombed London, and you can see there something of the trail of devastation that was left in the wake of the bombings. I mean, it was truly unbelievable what they did. Less known is that there were bombing campaigns all around the country, and this was similar in many, 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 many cities, just like this. And we've got a image from Coventry. So if we move on to the next slide, and we can see just the same in Coventry. I mean, utter devastation. Whole streets and neighbourhoods were just razed to the ground overnight. People, very little warning. They didn't know where to go. There were very few air raid shelters built in time. And in London, there was a community fight to get the government to open the underground, which was eventually won, but not immediately. And then people took up, sheltered in the underground. It was one of the safest places to go. So there was huge destruction, absolutely massive destruction. It also, of course, produced a fighting spirit. People suddenly realized that really what we were up against. And people responded. There was the most incredible response to the Blitz. If we look at the next slide, the Battle of Britain, we had our young men mobilise, had to mobilise them very, very fast, and they were tremendous. I mean, there was the most tremendous spirit, and young men were going up in planes with barely a week's training and fighting the Luftwaffe, and it was the most incredible effort perhaps this country's ever undertaken. We were fighting invasion. I mean, we really were. We were up against it. We were fighting for our lives. And we also developed some and deployed some key innovations as well as a result of the Blitz. Next slide. So there was the deployment of radar, which enables you to pick out your enemy's airborne location ahead of time and then pinpoint it. and also the deployment of anti-aircraft, ACAC as it's known, which is and both of which, I mean, bombing, radar, and anti-aircraft were key weapons for the duration of the Second World War. So deployed very early on here in Britain, and very successfully. We managed to fend off the Luftwaffe, and we won the Battle of Britain. And it was a key battle. And thereafter, we ramped up fully to a full war footing. But of course, the war dragged on for years. I mean, 6 years the Second World War went on for. There was huge war economies engaged. Britain, Germany, USSR, USA, all totally, geared their economies to their war economies. There were multiple fronts for fighting. And of course, by 1945, when the war was finally brought to an end, countries were absolutely depleted. There had been many casualties. There was heavy bombing everywhere. All resources of the countries had been dedicated to the war effort, and malnutrition and disease was widespread everywhere. So there was a huge reconstruction effort needed, absolutely massive, just at a time when countries were at their lowest ebb, really, after 6 years of gruesome battle. And the politics of reconstruction, again, we see how the effort to preserve where possible was conditioned entirely by politics. So we have an example here of a reconstruction, Coventry Cathedral. So we can see it there when it has been bombed, and then afterwards with the reconstruction. I mean, the reconstruction effort after the war really demonstrates that you don't win a war, you win a peace. And martial aid from the Americans was absolutely critical to both this country and Germany, particularly for winning the peace and enabling Germany to reconstruct and build a post-war peacetime society. And it was the only way it could do it. And in this country, we move to the next slide. Council housing. We have the first genuinely socialist government elected in 1945, and the Labour government committed to a whole range of post-war reconstruction, effectively. And one of the things they implemented was council house building on a wide scale. There was going to be homes for everyone. And they did. I mean, they had a massive social housing building program that went on for many decades. As a result, people got decent subsidised housing for the very first time in this country. So there was a major peace dividend, but it took huge conflict and destruction to make it happen. Okay, and then moving on to our final example then, Stonehenge. So Stonehenge, we'll look at the next slide. Is, yeah, can everyone see that? Oh, yeah, is the, there are 2 pictures of Stonehenge there.
Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So it's a prehistoric monument in Wiltshire on Salisbury Plain. The first sequences date to around 3000 BC, so about 5,000 years ago. And there's a range of sequences that follow on from that, lasting over 1,000 years. So it's a very, very important monument in this country. It's essentially a circular area. As you can see, it defines a circular space with banks, ditches, and stone circles all radiating into the centre. and it's built out of big stones, what we call megaliths, some of which are sarsen stones that come from the local area, and some of which are called blue stones, come from Wales, much further afield from the Preseli Hills. So Stonehenge is a number of ancient monuments that we find across the British Isles dating from this era, and very important to the people of the time. They'd meet here, they'd gather together, they'd feast, they'd exchange animals and other objects and engage in rituals. So really important sacred places even. And so, of course, you know, over the succeeding centuries and millennia, it's been an important place, and a place, again, not without conflict, and became subject to vandalism and destruction. So if we move on to the next slide, this is a picture by William Stukeley from the 17th century, showing contemporary destruction of megaliths by fire. I mean, that was quite a common practice. These big stones would be pulled down, burned and broken up, and then often reused for buildings. So Stonehenge was taken into state care in 1918, but has been regarded by the state as a money maker because it has so many visitors, and a lot of people have regarded that as cynical. And more recently, there was a proposal for a redevelopment at Stonehenge, and the first thing they said, they were going to put a new visitor centre in, which they've done, to mix reviews. But the other thing they said they were going to do was they were going to build a tunnel. And what they were going to do was they were going to route the tunnel under the ground and bury the A303, which carries a lot of traffic, and then hide the traffic from Stonehenge so the World Heritage Site, which has the designation, could be restored. Now, at first, the government said it didn't have the money to do this. And then, Mazza, if we move on to the next slide, the proposed tunnel. More recently, they've resurrected the tunnel idea, but they said they want to build a much shorter tunnel to save money. And as a result, there are real fears. Now, there are two big fears. The first is, as we look at this picture, that the new tunnel entrance will ruin the views from Stonehenge. So you can see Stonehenge flagged up in red and the new tunnel entrance. And the fears are that you'll look out from the monument and you'll see a great big tunnel entrance, which is the absolute opposite of what the original idea was for this tunnel. And then the second, if we move on to the next slide, the second site that there are real fears for is a site called Blixmead, which is just down the road from Stonehenge and has yet to be fully excavated. It's very, very rich in archaeological material. There are sequences going back from the earliest human occupation all the way through to the Roman era. And it's a really important site. It needs to be preserved. It needs to be saved for us and for future generations to be able to do the archaeology there properly, you know, to preserve what remains in situ. And the proposal, as you can see, runs the road right up next to Blixmead and will probably almost certainly destroy the site in its entirety. So there are real fears about this. It's currently in planning stages, and I hate to say this because, you know, I am among those who really don't want these issues to be politicised. I think it's the worst thing that can happen. But sadly, with the current government, planning regulations have been really loosened. And whereupon once upon a time, fears, concerns like this would be enough to stop a project like this. Now it's no longer the case. Even though we know that there's really good evidence that if you build a road, the traffic will go up in volume to use it. So the best way to stop traffic is not build the road in the first place. It's self-fulfilling. If you build a great big dual carriageway, the traffic will use it. So there should be much better options to save this, World Heritage Site of incredible sensitivity and importance. So I think those examples hopefully should give you some ideas about, both the value of our heritage, the sensitivities of it, the learning potential we get from it, the wider understanding it gives us about who we are and where we came from, but also the political, precisely because it's so valuable and so sensitive, the political issues that come into play around it and how preserving it and managing it for now and into the future is a complex task.
So,
Okay, that's it.
thank you very much, Kate. Thanks a lot. So, thank you. We have about 10 minutes, maybe for interaction.
Okay.
So, questions? Want some questions? Anybody have any clarification questions? पूछिए करेंगे पूछिए क्या जो मतलब जो बिल्डिंग जो रिकंस्ट्रक्ट करे बॉम्बिंग में गए तो कुछ इसके बारे में देखें ना हाँ.
So sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
नहीं जैसा हाँ जोर से बोलिए. हमने आ गए दूसरे भी तैयार है ना पूछने के लिए ठीक है. Whatever you want to ask, even teachers can ask.
Most oldest heritage in Britain.
Ask.
Most oldest heritage.
The oldest heritage building in Britain. That must be Stonehenge.
Sorry, what is the oldest building?
Heritage building.
Oh, that's a good question. I suppose there would be. It's a difficult question to answer because what do you mean by a building? Is Stonehenge a building? Yes, it is. Not a building as we would understand it, but it is nonetheless a building. So we can go back to the earliest equivalent buildings that predate Stonehenge, which go back probably 6,000 years ago. But then there are structures that go back even before that. And our hunter-gatherer ancestors were capable of putting up what you could call a building, even if it was seasonal or temporary or whatever. So the earliest, very earliest structures go back maybe 9,000 years. One thing we have in this country is a lot of caves where the hunter-gatherers would live. And we have cave art in those caves. So, and they were certainly inhabited and decorated and so on and so forth. So perhaps we could call those the earliest buildings.
Thank you very much, Kate. So you go back to cave art, and even in India we have got that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many Ajanta, Ellora, and so many others.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's one more young lady wanting to ask a question. Go ahead.
विक्टोरिया किसलिए कब कौन बनाया है?
Victoria
कौन बनाया है?
Victoria Museum.
हाँ विक्टोरिया म्यूजियम कौन बनाया है?
She wants to know about the Victoria Museum.
What do I know about the Victoria Museum?
Yeah.
Do you mean the Victoria and Albert Museum in London?
Yeah.
Not very much. Sorry about that.
Sir, what is the importance of restoring our heritage?
Yeah, there is one lady who's a young lady wanting to ask here. From here you can ask. From here you can ask. Are you able to see her? Are you able to see her?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Why the restoration of heritages is important for us?
She says why the restoration of heritage is important for us.
Sorry, why is it important for
Why
us?
is it important that we should restore and protect our heritage?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of reasons. I think that it's interesting and enjoyable at a very light level to visit places and to see them and to enjoy them. I think from the perspective of a range of disciplines, whether it's history, geography, archaeology, these are our basic tools that we're using to understand our past. And also, I think, I don't think we can understand ourselves really unless we understand where we came from and what we did in the past. It wasn't that long ago that we believed that from the Bible that the world was made in, whatever it was, in 7 to 6 days, and God took a rest on the seventh day, and they dated the history of the earth from the chronologies in the Bible. And it was only through the painstaking work of geologists and archaeologists and natural scientists like Charles Darwin in the 19th centuries, 18th and 19th centuries, that broke this model down and revealed the true age of the earth, revealed evolution to us, the workings of evolution, and revealed the deep history of us as human beings. So it's absolutely fundamental to understanding ourselves, how we evolved, what our past cultures look like, and what that influence is on our societies today. So I would say it's of the utmost importance.
Thank you very much, Kate. Very comprehensive answer. I think now you understand why we need to preserve heritage, restore heritage. It is to understand ourselves. Now there is one question you want to ask. There is one. Can you be a little loud?
Why is there any cathedral church in London only now?
Cathedral church, yeah.
Is the heritage of London?
Is Cathedral Church counted as heritage building in London?
Is there a
Cathedral Church? Is there something like that in London?
Temple?
Cathedral.
Sorry, I'm not picking it up very well. What church?
The cathedral. Cathedral church.
An integral church?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are many. There are many churches, although a lot of them in London got bombed by the Blitz. I mean, it was very sad. But if you go to the city of London, I mean, the other thing, of course, to remember if you go to London is there was the fire of London in 1666, which practically wiped out the old city of London. So there was a massive reconstruction effort after that fire. And a lot of the churches in the city of London were rebuilt then, including the St. Paul's by Sir Christopher Wren, who also built the Radcliffe Camera in Oxford. But if you really want to see some of the early stuff, the best place to head is to Westminster, because Westminster Abbey and the surrounding buildings, that dates back to the Norman period. So that's much, much older.
Yeah, thank you. So there is one last, what is that? Ask.
Which is the highest monument in London?
The highest
Yes.
monument, I don't know. The highest building is the Shard. Oh.
So I think.
I've just excuse
Yeah.
me 1 second. I've got to answer my doorbell. Hang on 1 second.
Please come to each other. कोई पूछेंगे वहाँ पे क्या last question about what are the present laws to protect heritage buildings? Yeah, important question. कोई पूछेंगे? Anybody? What are the laws to protect heritage buildings there in Britain? पूछेंगे कोई?
Sorry about that, folks. Coming, sorry. Just got a delivery, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no issues. So actually, one last question from my side.
Yeah.
Because, thank you very much for this very interesting, enlightening interaction.
Okay.
What are the laws presently in England to protect heritage, for restoration of heritage? Are there any specific thing where the government itself provides some funds or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, it's complicated because, you know, the way taxpayers' money is managed and given out in this country is complicated. So there's no one funding stream. I mean, it might come through a government body like the National Trust or English Heritage, who will often take sites into their care directly. They'll own them and then look after them. I mean, you know, there's a lot of stately homes and big houses that the old aristocracy were living in. And there came a point where they just couldn't afford to keep their own houses up because they were too expensive. So they would do a deal with the state, with the government, and they'd hand the property over. But in certain cases, you know, the family were allowed to stay in the property. I mean, there's numerous examples of this. But say every summer, they have to open parts of the property up to visitors, and then people can come and visit the site and walk around. So it's a sort of deal they've done with the state. So that's one way of doing it. But as I say, there are many ways.
So thank you very much, Kate. It's been very enlightening and a pleasure, and hope you'll be able to interact with us again sometime with some school students in their schools. Here we have brought them to a place,
Yeah.
a fort, and the children have gone around looking at the fort, and now they're interacted with you. So I think we really appreciate the time and the effort that you have put into this, and we like to.
Well, best of luck, everyone, with your heritage careers. Really, it's very important and enjoyable as well. It's really interesting and fun. So, best of luck, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
a lot, Kate. I'll get back to you a little later.
Okay. Bye
Thank
for
you.
now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.